everyone. I hope you had a good weekend. Good start to week 4 of the semester. So, this week we're going to talk about Walt Whitman. But before we get into Walt Whitman, it would behoove us to kind of relate what he's doing to what Dickinson was doing, right? So, with Dickinson, this lineage from Whitman runs back in time as well as forward, right? Whitman can be looked at as a culmination of certain deep and basic American yearnings, right? Not just only in poetry, but also in philosophical and devotional prose that run through Emerson and even Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin, right? So, some speculation along those lines could do much to situate Whitman's mind in the history of the American imagination, the boundless dream, and the hunger for new beginnings, right? Entering and appreciating the craft of Whitman's poetry, however, is a different sort of project, right? Whitman and Dickinson, as you'll see, or have seen if you started this week's reading, are so different, right? Almost diametrically so. The comparison to Dickinson is kind of heady, but it's also useful, right? So, with Whitman, we have a poet that sprawls, right? And you'll see that in his use of lines. And then we have Dickinson, right, who seems to lock herself into, a more constrictive meter, right, that was bound off of her influence of Christian hymnals, even though, yes, she was breaking form and being kind of at the forefront of newer poetic ideas in that sense. But the question is, can all of this be poetry, right? And especially poetry of the same historical movement, right? And the answer is yes, right? Because what brings them together are the characteristics of American Romanticism, right? The focus on the individual, the celebration of nature as a source of spirituality, frequently, and the imagination. So, Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819, in West Hills, New York, which is now Long Island. And when he was young, his family moved to Brooklyn. In his mid-20s, he became a free soiler, right? Which was an organized group that opposed westward expansion for the use of more territory for slavery. And during the Civil War, he became a nurse in D.C., right? And this is a time where his poetry started to kind of take a darker turn. He aligned himself as a poet of the working class, right? And this is very important. Perhaps because he himself was poor for most of his life, and perhaps that he believed that everyone in America deserved to be an American and deserved to have the same rights, right? He was a poet who answered the call of Emerson for an American poet who would address all of the facts of the animal economy, sex, nutriment, gestation, and birth, right? So his subject matter in a single poem can just span and continue to grow and sprawl. We'll see that in his use of line breaks or the lack thereof in some spots, and also his subject matter and how he tries to make everything universal, right, and quintessentially American. He was also one of the most photographed people in the 19th century, right? This is a picture towards the end of his life. It was taken in 1891. And there are tons of photographs available at the Walt Whitman Archive, right? Now, free verse and the rejection of meter. Free verse really is why we didn't spend an incredible amount of time discussing Dickinson's use of rhythm and meter, right? We talked about end rhyme, um, and a little bit of her structure, but we didn't really do a lot of scanning, right? We weren't talking about like it being an iambic pentameter or anything of that nature. And I know I had said that that was, kind of something you would get into if you took an upper level poetry class, but also if you had taken, a course where more writers wrote formally, right? So you can thank Whitman that we're not going to spend a ton of time on that because his use of free verse and the rejection of meter, had massive influence on later poets at the time, and then, the way that of most American writers write today. Um, so, free verse is an open form of poetry, right? It doesn't have a consistent form or a meter or pattern, right? Though it's non-metrical, right? Um, and it's unrhymed. So in a nutshell, it is unrhymed, unmetered verse. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, he was just blindly writing. There's great musicality in his pieces, but it's the musicality of himself, right? Which makes sense because Whitman was a champion of the self and the individual. Um, so not to be constrained by rules, right? Which is exactly what poetic form is. It's just very boxed in rules, right? Um, so the major point to underscore is that Whitman's working class background provided him with a much different perspective on life than many of his Ivy League educated peers, such as Emerson and Thoreau, would have to offer, right? Um, he just had more life experiences, right? It's not to say that, he's not a classically trained writer, right? Though he is one of the most important writers ever. Um, so, scholars have argued that that is why he really dove into free verse, but it also affects his subject matter, and not only his subject matter, but his outlook on life, right? Um, you know, he had lived so many more experiences than a lot of other writers, right? Um, so that makes him more empathetic. It makes him be able to relate with different groups of people in a way that, you know, a lot of these stuffier kind of, just stuffier writers could, right? Um, he had more empathy, he had more experience, he had more to say, and it's also why he saw himself, kind of as a man of the people, right? Someone that, could speak for all of America. And when we look at his pieces, we'll see how that's not necessarily true, and it's addressed later on. Um, and we'll get to Langston Hughes in a few weeks. He has a poem that is a direct address to Whitman, essentially saying that you missed out and kind of skipped over an incredibly important group of people in the United States, but we'll get there when we get there down the road. Um, So, scholars of American literature are virtually unanimous in agreeing that no single book did more to transform American and ultimately world poetry and literature than the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, right? With its bold rejection of poetic norms, its self consciously American diction, language, and the unique poetic persona of a man who is at once a representative of his nation and a distinct individual, Leaves of Grass influenced and continues to influence generations of poets. Right? Um, we'll see it with Allen Ginsberg when we look at Hal, too. Hal would not exist if Walt Whitman didn't exist. Despite the impact that the book would eventually have, though, it had a rather inauspicious beginning. Whitman paid to have the book published. He self-published it because no one wanted to publish it. It received pretty down the road mixed reviews, and there's evidence that he came nowhere near to selling all of the 800 copies that he had printed. Though Ralph Waldo Emerson famously sent Whitman a letter of praise, which Whitman capitalized upon by reprinting the letter without permission in a New York City newspaper, and again as an appendix in the second 1856 edition of Leaves of Grass. The first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855 did not include an author byline. The copyright is attributed to Walter Whitman, but at no point does it say that it's by Walt Whitman. Instead, Whitman included this portrait to identify himself. Now, this portrait is incredibly important in terms of trying to understand who Whitman wanted to be as an American writer, right? Antebellum reviewers were swift to note that Whitman had the demeanor and appearance of a working class outlaw, with one reviewer in particular saying that he bears, quote, the true likeness of half a dozen celebrated criminals, end quote. Whitman refers to himself in Song of Myself as one of the roughs, right, which was a vernacular of 18th century New York. The roughs were the working class urbanites, many of whom were immigrants who were feared and distrusted by the city's middle class and upper class population, right? So, my question for you is, why do you think Whitman chose to identify with the working class outlaws, right? What type of persona is he hoping to communicate to his readers by this being the photo or illustration that he puts out there for the world to announce himself as, a new American writer, he would like to say, and became the voice of America at the time. Why this, right? It has parallels in contemporary music, right? From, outlaw country to, gangster rap in the 90s. We see artists align themselves with these kind of, fringe ideas or people kind of on the outlying space of society. And one of the curious things about Whitman is that not only did he want to be seen as a fringe figure, but also wanted to be regarded as a representative American poet. So, what does that say about America? What is Whitman saying about America then? Also, right, when the Civil War began in 1861, Whitman was too old to fight for the Union Army. He would have been 42. Nevertheless, he wanted to be involved and felt like he needed to help in some way, so he became a nurse at a Union hospital in D.C., right, where he tended to both Union and Confederate soldiers. And his experiences with all of these soldiers and young men informed the poems that he published as drum taps, right? So, kind of a collection about his time and experience dealing and tending to all of these wounded soldiers. And again, it's this idea of him, trying to experience as much of America and an American consciousness as he can, right? Because if he wants to be a representative, the voice of America, right? He has to be involved in all of it, which also makes him, the more that you see and the more that you're exposed to in life, the more empathetic you become as well, right? The less closed minded you are. Um, and that comes across and grows as time goes on within Whitman's writing career. Now, to turn focus a little, talk about some of the major literary devices that Whitman uses, right? Because he's writing in free verse, which is essentially free for all, free form poetry. It's not rhymed, it's not metered, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have rhythm. It doesn't have its own musicality. He's not using poetic devices. Some of the major ones that we'll see him use, there are many more, though, are alliteration, consonance, assonance, and anaphora, right? We've seen alliteration and anaphora before with Dickinson, right? Remember, we have alliteration um, all throughout both the pieces that we looked at and everything that I had you read. And then we have anaphora in Because I Could Not Stop for Death, right? Remember, there's the repetition of we again and again, and that's meant to remind the reader that the speaker is not alone in their passage to the afterlife, right? They have our personified death with them in the carriage. Because remember, anaphora is a rhetorical device that, in poetry, is the repetition of a word or a phrase at the beginning of a line, right? It's a form of repetition, but a specific one. And its purpose is to convey or emphasize an idea or meaning, to keep a piece rolling. We'll see, kind of moving along. We'll see how that functions in When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed in both of those ways. And then we have alliteration, consonance, and assonance, right? Again, alliteration. We know consonants and assonance are forms of alliteration. They're just subtly different, right? Very easy to differentiate, though. Consonance is the repetition of consonant sounds, right? Our example is coming and home, hot, foot, right? We have a repetition of those sounds of the consonants, but they're not at the beginning of the word, right? That's an important difference to keep in mind. And assonance is the same thing with vowels, right? Meat, bean, right? You have that ing sound being repeated, but again, not at the beginning of the word. So, both forms of alliteration, but subtly different. And we'll go over more when we go over his poems. But these are four of the big ones that we'll see him use. So, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, we're not going to go over the poem in this video, but you need some background. It'll make you sitting down reading it much easier. I think it's 8 pages, I believe, and it's dense, and there's a lot going on. So, having this knowledge before you embark on the piece will, you'll be more informed and you won't be as confused, hopefully. But a little bit of background. Abraham Lincoln, right, shot in D.C. by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865, and he died the following day. Now, after that, his body was sent by train from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, right? And it essentially became a, half the nation cross-country funeral procession, right? Yeah. People came out to watch his casket go by, and that is what this entire piece, uh, it's not what it's about, but it is what's happening in the piece, right? Whitman is doing the same thing that so many other Americans are doing, right? Which again also has to do with unity. Um, when Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed is an elegy about the death of Abraham Lincoln, though it never mentions the president's name, right? Like most elegies, it develops from the personal, the death of Lincoln. We'll see the grief of the poet, to the impersonal, right? We'll see the death of all of you and this idea of death itself. From an intense feeling of grief to the thought of reconciliation, right? Essentially, the mourning process. That's very much so what this poem is about as well. Um, it's a dramatization of this feeling of loss, right? So, an elegy is a poem of serious reflection and 99% of the time is a lament for the dead, right? In traditional English poetry, it is often a melancholy poem that laments its subject's death but ends in some form of consolation, right? But it's also pastoral, and pastoral is an idealized version of country life. Hence, we have a pastoral elegy, right? Um, which is a very unique thing in writing, right? So the word pastoral comes from the Greek word pastor, which means to graze. So hence, a pastoral elegy is an elegy in which the poet represents himself as a shepherd mourning the death of a fellow shepherd, which is an incredibly important point to consider in this piece, right? Lincoln tried to shepherd the American people back together, right? During the Civil War, and now that he is gone, Whitman is attempting to do the same, though through a piece of writing, right? So again, it goes back to the idea of Whitman being a voice of the people, right? And he would argue a voice of reason. Now, this idea, the three major symbols throughout the piece, are really going to be helpful when you sit down and read it, right? We can consider it a kind of non-religious trinity, right? We have the lilac, the star, and the hermit thrush, or the bird, right, that reoccur again and again throughout the piece. And they all are very specific symbols. The thrush is a little more expanded, but the lilac is the memory of Lincoln, right? It's grief, this idea of unity throughout the country, right? The lilac leaves represent love. Lilac leaves kind of look like hearts. And then, it's not lost to Whitman that he chose lilacs to lay down on Lincoln's coffin. Lilacs are one of the few flowers found throughout every state, at least in the continental United States. So we have this idea of us all being connected, even though at the time during the Civil War we're so insanely fractured. We have the star, which, easiest one, just represents Lincoln, right, or the death of Lincoln. And then finally, we have the hermit thrush, or the bird. This one's a little more confusing because it has to do with Whitman kind of working through his grief. So, as one does when they work through grief, they go through stages and processes. So the bird evolves a little bit more than the lilac and the star do. Originally, you'll see it's the thought of him I love, right? And then the bird's carol or song becomes equivalent of the opening thought of the poem. It also represents spirituality, the acceptance of death, and the poet's soul. So there's more going on with the bird, but you'll see how it evolves and how Whitman aligns himself with the hermit thrush. And the song of the bird is the music of death, right? It's meant to teach men to accept these realities. Helen Vendler, a literary critic, also points out that the three symbols, the lilac of this earth, the star of the evening sky, and the hermit thrush of the dark, lowered swamp, by apportioning his poem among classical three realms of the upper world, the middle world, and the underworld, Whitman is also giving a cosmic importance rather than political importance to the death of Lincoln, right? It means much more than just the assassination of a president, right? It has much larger implications. So definitely keep these symbols in mind when you start going through the poem. It will make it much easier to understand and to follow. Um, in terms of the poem itself, I will have that video up later today or tomorrow morning. And we'll obviously go through it, talk about these symbols, talk about this whole concept of grief and trying to unify the country when it's most fractured that it could possibly be, and talk about all the different sections, etc. So if you have any questions, you can address those in the discussion board post for this week. Keep in mind as well that if anyone wants to kind of get some ideas out there and start a little discourse with your peers that I'll chime in on, if you tend to do that regularly, that could lead to some extra credit as well, so keep that in mind. But